This is the Eglinton Jerk. Welcome to the Eglinton West Pop-Up Podcast. Today, we're talking with award-winning journalist Desmond Cole. He's written for everybody from Now Magazine to Canada Landland to BuzzFeed, at the Toronto Star's a columnist, and for 5 years at 1010 CFRB here in Toronto. He's branded the shit out of the Skinway Inn, which is an award-winning piece he did with Toronto Life magazine, and morphed into a CBC documentary directed by one of my favorite filmmakers of all time, Charles Officer, that filmmaking policeman. And then, of course, the Skinway Inn, Desmond, A Year of Black Resistance and Power, released in January 2020 and became a best-selling Canadian book that year. Welcome to the Eglinton West Pop-Up Podcast, Desmond Cole.
It's a pleasure to be with you, Clifton.
What was your motivation for getting into journalism in the first place? Were you just a curious kid, like a curious cat?
I don't think I really knew for sure that I wanted to be in journalism until maybe my mid to late 20s. That was when it really started to become something that I thought about. I didn't go to school for journalism. I've always liked the written word, though. I've always liked to write. I've always liked storytelling. And eventually, there was just a progression for me from writing my own blog to writing for Torontoist, an online publication that when I started with them paid $15 a piece. But you do it because you're loving to do it. You're losing money writing for a publication, but you love it, so you're doing it. And I've been very fortunate where my writing has gotten into places that were bigger and distributed more widely. And so I never expected that I was going to make the majority of my career as a writer and a journalist, but I've always loved storytelling. And I have always been curious about language and about narrative, and also about holding power to account through storytelling, which is what I think journalism is at its best.
How would you describe your career in terms of the subject matter you were dealing with before the Skinway Inn for Toronto Life magazine?
I was a local journalist and a local reporter. And so rather than mostly writing opinion pieces, which is what I started doing later for Toronto Star, I was going to community meetings, which I still do. I was going to demonstrations and protests and sit-ins, which I still do. And I was trying to document them. I was trying to make it so that, like, if you weren't there that day or that evening or that morning, that you would get a sense of what it felt like and what it sounded like and what it smelled like from the reporting. So I went to community meetings. I went to meetings about karting. I went to openings of community gardens that the bougie community around the community garden didn't want. I went to the demonstration for Sammy Yatim when he was murdered by James Forcillo and saw hundreds of outraged people, students, just folks from people who had never been to demonstrations before coming and marching. And I documented those kind of things to try and say, like, this is what it felt like for me, witnessing these things, being around these things. And that was the kind of work on a very local Toronto level, going to committee meetings, going to community meetings, going to Dixon after it was raided, and going to a community meeting in the bottom of a building at Dixon where the mostly Somali community there who wanted to come to this meeting talked about the raids that had just happened there, but also about substandard housing, lack of repairs, lack of amenities in the community. I fell in love with journalism from a local perspective, is what I'm trying to say. And that spurred me to write about other things later.
Mm-hmm. And where do you place, because for those of us looking from the outside, it would seem as if a pivotal shift was when you did that article for Toronto Life magazine, The Skinway Inn, chronicling your over 50 or so times being basically stopped by the police. Where is that in your own sense of your own journalistic trajectory?
I had been advocating and writing about Blackness and Black issues and white supremacy for a long time before that 2015 piece. But I think that the thing that really shifted for me before that piece was I went to Ferguson, Missouri in late 2014 to document the uprising for Mike Brown in Ferguson after he was murdered, by there's so many police officers whose names we'll have to keep in our minds, and this one is not coming to me right now, but you know.
But before George Floyd and so on, Mike Brown was a pivotal, because there was Burn, Baby Burn, those weeks following that, and a lot of police forces, and it was a real pivotal point too that time in terms of coalesce the Black Lives Matter movement, and people are going against police brutality against Black bodies in America.
That's it. And it did something for me too, because two things happened. Number one, I witnessed some of the most fierce and beautiful and powerful Black activism that I have ever witnessed in my life. And I wrote 4 pieces for Walrus magazine. But then I also watched from my hotel room as Black Lives Matter Toronto launched while I was in Ferguson, and wished that I was home covering this emergence of people talking about Jermaine Carby and later Andrew Loku, and raising awareness about Black trans women who go missing in Toronto that is documented from here mostly only in the United States, talking about incarceration rates, talking about our kids in school. And I saw that happening and launching in Toronto while I was in Ferguson. And that also really made me want to go back home and continue this kind of Black radical storytelling.
Wow, excellent, excellent. Let's deal with the matter at hand, the elephant in the room, if it will. We had a most recent decision from the Ontario Court of Justice that for the second time in less than a year or two, exonerated Judge Donald Mcleoad for improprieties, what have you. Let's look at that case for a moment. But before we go there, there are 3 names that are mentioned a lot in the last little while from people I hear and on social media and so on. It's L. Jones out in Halifax, ex-poet laureate of Halifax, and a poet, a professor. Ronaldo Walcott, another professor here in Toronto of Bajan extraction. And of course, most mud seems to be held back for you, Bo. You're not loved by a lot of people, or maybe not a lot, but a number of people inside of the Black community. They see you as having a vendetta against Judge Mcleoad. Do you have, what is your vendetta against Judge Mcleoad, first of all?
I think a vendetta is a really interesting word because it suggests some kind of interpersonal feud rather than a political one. So I simply politically disagree with the choices that Justice Mcleoad makes and with the political choices of many people who are defending him and who are collaborating with him within government and other powerful institutions. I want to tell you something, Clifton, because I've been thinking about our conversation tonight, and people have asked me if I have a vendetta, if I'm obsessed with Donald Mcleoad. Why did I write blog posts about him? Why did I go to public events that he was at and document them? I'm a journalist. And the idea that Justice Mcleoad and the FBC, the Federation of Black Canadians that he started, is not in need of any journalistic check or documentation, I just reject that idea. Justice Mcleoad started FBC for the public's purposes anyway, at the end of 2017. And many of us were interested in this idea of a Black advocacy organization, which was led by a judge, because common sense tells you judges are not allowed to do advocacy. But here we had one saying he is okay to do that. So from the beginning, a lot of people, not just myself, had a lot of questions about that. But I have pursued this story for 3 years because when people, 3.5 now, because when people stand up in our community who already have power and authority, Clifton, and say, I am also going to start this organization and it's going to do this and this and this for our community, that's something that I'm personally interested in as a Black person and professionally interested in as a journalist. And my need to hold to account people who say that they want to fight and represent us doesn't stop because the person is Black. It's not personal. It's not a feud. It's journalism. And I actually want to read you something from another journalist, because I know you're a journalist, I'm a journalist. I want to read you something from another well-known Black journalist. So to set this up, several years ago when Rob Ford was the mayor, there was a dispute or an accusation, let's call it a set of accusations made, but against a reporter named Daniel Dale at the Toronto Star.
Who ended up with CNN, became Washington Bureau, the Toronto Star, ended up with CNN, and I think they kicked him out after Biden got into power. He was the fact checker.
The fact checker, correct. The renowned fact checker, Daniel Dale, who covered Trump so vociferously.
Mm-hmm.
When Daniel Dale was writing for the Star, he went to check out a property near Rob Ford, who was mayor at the time, near Rob Ford's house. And he was looking at this property because Rob Ford wanted to buy it from the city. And there was this notion that maybe the mayor is going to get a really good and unfair deal on this piece of land because he's the mayor. Dale went to check it out. He went to the area. It's close to Rob Ford's house, but not like in his house.
Mm-hmm.
Ford proceeded to then make some accusations that Daniel Dale was peeking into his backyard and trying to look at his underage daughter. And when Ford saw Daniel Dale that evening, he chased him with a cocked fist as if he was going to assault him. Mm-hmm. And Daniel dropped his phone, which Rob Ford then confiscated. So he essentially robbed a journalist.
Rob Ford robbing a journalist?
Rob Ford, the name fits. So a columnist at the Toronto Star came to Daniel Dale's defense and clarified, of course, as we all found out later and probably suspected, that Daniel Dale wasn't in Rob Ford's backyard spying on his underage daughter, but Rob Ford made that up to avoid accountability. And I want to read you what this column said about that and about Daniel's behavior and about journalism now.
Mm-hmm.
So he is not a peeping Tom, as the mayor claims. Not that there is anything wrong with a reporter being a peeping Tom. It goes with the job. We are proud of such name calling. We have no shame. It's what we do. If a public official won't talk to us at the office, we try for a comment at his home. Make yourself available like any other public official, and there is no need to follow you home. Hide and dodge and refuse to disclose your schedule or communicate only to your favorite reporters or news outlets, and the ink-stained wretches will trundle over to your favorite watering hole to see if you are more inclined to talk there.
Beautiful words.
If the mayor says he can't attend the Pride Parade because he can't possibly miss family time at the cottage, we go up to the cottage to see if he is in fact there. Call it snooping if you want. We won't lose any sleep over the characterization. It's our job. You know who wrote that, Clifton? Royson James.
Tell me.
Royson James, the former columnist at the Toronto Star, and somebody who, when I was at the Toronto Star, fought for me to have a better place in that institution. Once upon a time, Royson James wrote this piece talking about how journalists are supposed to follow the story like a dog with a bone. That when journalists are documenting the issues of powerful people, that they have to be vigilant and aggressive, and that they have to do things that maybe people find distasteful.
Like getting down and dirty in somebody's garbage.
So it's interesting that Royson James, who has been one of my biggest critics about Justice Mcleoad, has decided that I don't apply in the same light as someone like Daniel Dale. The title of that piece is I Believe Daniel Dale. But somehow when I report that Justice Mcleoad has been doing things that are also against the Black community's interest and has been calling up other Black people to try and alter and silence and blunt their activism, Royson didn't believe me, and he thinks that what I'm doing is like, I don't know, I suppose it's some kind of aggression against Justice Mcleoad rather than just aggressive journalism. So I think that we can't have a different set of standards when it's a Black person in power. I think we can't have a different set of standards when the person is part of our faith group or our community, that if they want to wield power, then if they want to collect money on behalf of the community, which FBC has also done, if they want to get into all those things, they should expect people to have questions. Look at the Black Lives Matter global network. A lot of the people who don't like my reporting on Donald Mcleoad have been eating up reporting, necessary reporting, that Black Lives Matter in the US got $90 million, and even their own chapters, some of whom have defected, are like, we don't know what you did with the money.
Didn't get a cent.
We can make that same argument and say Black people shouldn't talk about each other in public, but I want to know who that serves. That's
Okay,
not my aim as a journalist.
Let's rewind about your first interactions with Judge Mcleoad. Was it at the Governor General Michelle Jean? She organized a big conference. Was that where you first intersected with Judge Donald Mcleoad?
In terms of having a conversation, yeah, I had been at events with him in the past before, but the first summit in 2017, the National Black Canadian Summit, is the first time that I spoke with him.
And he had formed, and he had helped form the Federation of Black Canadians at that point, or was it just around then?
That was literally the coming out party of the Federation of Black Canadians.
What was your problem? What were the red flags, as it were, with the Federation of Black Canadians that you realized something was smelling fishy?
I mean, how much time do you have? They had a steering committee whose membership included the Minister of Citizenship and Immigration's spouse. So the minister himself spoke at the National Black Canadian Summit and suggested he was also himself a member of this group. There were all kinds of liberals who seemed to be associated, like partisan, high-ranking liberals who seemed to be associated with this group, but that group was just being introduced to the public. So it was really clear that like this group that says it's representing us actually went to politicians before consulting the community about here's what we want to do, here's what we want our agenda to be. The summit itself was deeply problematic. I've written about all of this in a chapter of my book, The Skin We're In, but the summit itself was a big issue to me because it was like we were all there to co-sign a kind of agenda that FBC had already created before we got there. And so there were these like sessions facilitated by white facilitators from Deloitte Consulting who were there to kind of like build consensus. But it's like, you have 45 minutes, you've never met the people in the room, you've not talked about any ideas, but you're really just there to co-sign a political agenda that you don't even really know anything about. And it was very clear to me that FBC and the government were working kind of behind the scenes on their own thing, but that they hoped that this summit would kind of validate their agenda and say, look, we had all these Black people here and they all were happy at the summit without any real political debate or discussion. Again, I am far from the only person who noticed this. A lot of people wrote about it. A lot of people talked about it. People don't like it when it's a powerful Black person, particularly in an institution like the judiciary. But if you want to be the one running an organization, which was questionable for Mcleoad from the beginning, people are going to have questions. Where does the money come from? How do people get elected? What issues are you going to advocate for? And they're going to expect answers. So that's where the reporting comes from. And that was where a lot of our concerns started coming from.
Now, you've done extensive work on looking at the Federation of Black Canadians. And let's cut to some of the chase that there's a matter of $425,000 that they receive from the federal government. Talk to me about the lobbying of an actual sitting judge, MP, Judge Mcleoad, actually lobbying politicians in office, going to Ottawa, meeting with them, fronting an organization, getting money from the federal government and trying to disperse it. Give me some of the details around that conflict of interests as I see it, or as you might see it.
Okay, so there's a lot to say here and I'll try to be as brief as I can, but basically, I mentioned Royson James earlier, and I think most of us would consider him to be an elder in the Black community.
Absolutely, an elder journalist too, yes.
But particularly an elder journalist, right? So I want to talk about another elder person who's since passed, but who many people respected and looked up to, which is former MP Howard McCurdy.
NDP out of Windsor.
That's right. And Howard, the first Black NDP member of Parliament, he also later founded the National Black Coalition of Canada in the late 60s. And Howard McCurdy is somebody that Donald Mcleoad told us at the summit and many times afterward that he consulted before deciding to do this FBC advocacy group. He told us that Howard McCurdy gave him some advice, which was, don't accept money from the federal government, because then you lose your independence as a Black organization and things get too intermixed with government. So if you're going to do this, Donald, don't accept any money from government, maintain your independence. Justice Mcleoad subsequently told us many times that the FBC was never going to apply for federal funding because of what Howard McCurdy had told him. It's not $425,000, Clifton. FBC has, that I can find, received at least $700,000, both grants from Heritage Canada, one for $430,000.
To
And
do
one,
what?
well, one is, I believe, an anti-racism project, and the other, I can bring them up for you, but like they are.
What I'm saying though is that the organization hasn't been around that long, and I don't know that they've set up offices and had programs running, right? So I'm just at a loss to see what programs they actually administered for that money.
In fact, the Federation and Donald said one of the reasons why they would never apply for federal funding is that there were already established Black groups who have been doing frontline work and who have been engaging and writing grant proposals for years.
I can imagine that the Jamaican Canadian Association and Tropicana as two of the major ones, for instance, out of Toronto.
There are so many.
And way more, yes.
There are dozens across the country, right? And so they said that they wouldn't apply for funding because they didn't want to take away from those established Black organizations that have been doing this for a long time. And what I want to ask people outside of the hearing decision, because some people seem to really think that I'm fixated on whether the OJC found Donald guilty or not. By the way, some of Donald's very shameful supporters are saying that I filed both complaints against him. That's a lie.
That I'll ask you directly. Did you, Desmond Cole, file complaints with the OJC against Judge Mcleoad?
No, I never did that. And the name of the person who did so the first time is published in all of the documents, including this most recent hearing. Her name is Faith Finistad, and she knew about FBC before all the Black people in our community did.
Who is she? Who is Faith Finistad?
She's a former Associate Chief Justice of the Ontario Court. In other words, she was a colleague of Justice Mcleoad, who herself witnessed his lobbying and thought this is not appropriate for a judge. And long before any of us knew about FBC publicly, she was privately warning him to stop, and she ultimately filed the first complaint against him. The name of the second complainant has actually been redacted from the complaint, and Justice Mcleoad has clearly suggested to his followers, or some of them have decided to believe, that that is also me. But Justice Mcleoad has a copy, I'm sure, and he was asked directly in court if it was me, and he didn't say that it was me. Mm-hmm. And he has a copy of the complaint. No, I don't think they can file a complaint against him and be anonymous. So if he wants to show people that I filed a complaint against him, he should demonstrate that. It's sad
get back to the dollar bill, baby. Let's keep on chasing the money.
Okay, I'm getting back to that, but I just wanted to say that I just wanted to offer that as a kind of like, I know that even if I tell people, here's the proof that I didn't file the complaint, they will still hold me responsible. And Clifton, I take responsibility for my reporting, but that's it. I don't take responsibility for what other people do with my reporting. It's up to them. And it's up to the Judicial Council whether they even deem what people are saying relevant. And if what I was saying was all irrelevant, Justice Mcleoad wouldn't have agreed to most of my reporting in his own hearing. And the OJC wouldn't have agreed with a great deal of what I reported in.
So what's been your relationship with the OJC though, in terms of them?
Zero. I had interaction with the OJC when they called me for evidence for the second hearing. And like anybody who is subpoenaed by a court who doesn't want to go to jail and be found in contempt of court, I went. That is the only interaction that I have had with OJC, except for asking for documents when I cover the hearing as a journalist. But I don't know why Faith Finistad chose to make the complaint that she did, other than what she told us at the OJC. I have never met her. It certainly seems like she is also behind the second complaint because of the way that it's written, and the language of it is online and people can read it because it says the person who's writing it refers to themselves as having responsibilities under section da 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 of the act. So sounds like a judge or another one of his colleagues to me. But like I said, I'm a journalist. I accept responsibility if people say your stories led to evidence against Donald. I reported what I knew. I reported what people told me. I reported what even people who were part of FBC, who are not part of it anymore, because a lot of people have left. I reported what they wanted me to know in terms of accountability. They want to make this about me. It's not about me.
What were the nature of the questions that the OJC wanted of you?
They wanted to know if I could verify the contents of my reporting for the most part, and how I could prove that the things that I had reported were true. How could I prove that Justice Mcleoad called two people in Halifax after they were racially profiled at an FBC event?
That was a bunch of young folks who came from Halifax, and they were on Parliament Hill, and the security guards clearly racially profiled them. And then when they got back to Halifax, the Judge Mcleoad called them over the phone to do what?
To tell them, among other things, that if they continued to do media about their experience of being racially profiled, that there was a parliamentary investigation happening at the time, and that they might be investigated by the parliamentary investigation, which is a really threatening and just awful thing to say to people who are speaking about a racial profiling incident that really happened to them. And here's the thing, Clifton, again, outside of whether or not the OJC said that was wrong, which they did, they ruled that he did two things that were incompatible with judicial office, and calling those two folks was one of them. But I actually want to talk about this from a Black community perspective once again. If somebody with power in our community doesn't like what other people with relatively no power compared to him, he doesn't like what they're doing, what they're saying publicly, does he have the right to call them and mislead them and say, you'll be investigated if you speak up, which is clearly a form of a threat? And am I the bad person for reporting that? Or is that actually something that we as Black people want to know when it's happening? Because if other people don't want to know about that, they shouldn't concern themselves with it. But asking me to turn my eyes away from that, I'm not going to do it. So, you know, these are things that I reported. These are things that the OJC ruled on. But more importantly, this is a pattern of behavior from a Black person with a lot of influence, who I think by any standard, even outside of a court, shouldn't be using his influence for that. And that's the conversation that a lot of people don't want to have, but that we need to have. So
Speaking of conversation, there was a second phone conversation intervention by the judge. Which was that, and why do you find that so not above board?
I'm going to get back to the money in a minute too, but I'm really glad that you brought all of this up. In 2017, at that first summit, when I told Justice Mcleoad that your way of facilitating and rushing people to false consensus at this summit is inappropriate, and we need more time and more process to have conversations about what to do for Black communities in Canada, that you can't just force us all into a room for a couple of days with a group of facilitators, professional facilitators, and come to a consensus. That's not real consultation. And we as Black people know what a phony consultation looks like. After we had that conversation at the summit, I also spoke out with L. Jones, one of the other people that they are very upset at, Justice Mcleod's people. We spoke up for a young man named Abdul Abdi, who at that time was at risk of being deported because he came here as a refugee, as an asylum seeker, as a child. He was taken into the child welfare system. And so his only legal parents, which were the government, didn't apply for his citizenship, that of his and his sister Fatuma, neither of whom to this day have Canadian citizenship. So it's interesting that a Black advocacy group showed up at this summit right at the time that this was happening, because Minister Hussein, the immigration minister, was at this event.
A Black man.
He is. And we raised the issue of Abdul and his potential deportation with the minister. It was that situation that led Justice Mcleoad to pick up the phone in 2018. Because after we noticed that all kinds of people were advocating for Abdul's stoppage of his deportation, but FBC wasn't, we called them out for it. We would say on social media, it's a shame that this group with all of its connections is not helping anybody, not helping Abdul, not helping this young man They say they're advocates. Here's a case that most Black people agree that we should be advocating for. They're not doing it. We were critical of them for several weeks about that. And then Justice Mcleoad got the telephone number of my friend and colleague and called her on a holiday Monday and started talking about Abdul's case. People who are close to us have said that this was some kind of, people who are upset with us, I should say, have said that this was some kind of entrapment of Donald Mcleoad because my friend and colleague Adil Abdullahi recorded the conversation. Maybe people think it's just benign, normal for a judge to get a phone number of somebody he doesn't know very well personally, get their number from a relative and pick up the phone and call them.
Saying what though? What was the judge saying to her?
Saying to her basically, I'm trying to do things about this Abdul situation. You all might see me and think that I'm not doing anything, but really behind the scenes, I am.
Mm-hmm.
So Professor Abdullahi proceeded to say, what you guys are doing is not real help. It's not real support. She had a very long conversation with him, which she recorded. And by the way, if she had not recorded that conversation, people would be telling us today that everything that is captured there was not true and didn't happen. Mm-hmm. So I'm glad that she recorded the conversation. But basically, after 3 hours of conversation, Justice Mcleoad said, I hear what you're saying now about Abdul. I want to help. How do I help? And Professor Abdullahi enumerated a list of things that FBC could do that would actually help.
Mm-hmm.
Justice Mcleoad testified at his hearing that because he didn't want to run afoul of his job, he took all the suggestions that Professor Abdullahi gave him and he threw them away. That he ripped up the notes that he had and threw them in the garbage, and that nothing that he passed on from that conversation was what she recommended. In other words, he pretended to help a young person facing deportation to take the heat off of his advocacy group, and in reality tried to do his own thing as they had been doing before instead of really helping Abdul Abdi. That was the phone call that he made that caused so much controversy because people say that he asked for an off-the-record conversation and it should have been recorded. First of all, if you're a judge, like I said, and it's your habit of calling people who are making political decisions that you don't agree with, and you want to call them up and influence them when you know this young man is before a federal court, and you know that you calling somebody about it is not right and you're not supposed to do it in the first place, and it can only be interpreted. It's like, I think there's this idea that that call would be interpreted as wanting to help somebody.
Mm-hmm.
But he testified himself that he didn't help Abdul.
But again, though,
the whole idea is that he had to say, I didn't help Abdul in order to save his job. But he revealed that I took what Professor Abdullahi gave me and then I did nothing with it. But then subsequently, FBC took credit for helping Abdul. So which is it? Did you do it and don't want the FBC or the OJC to know? Or is it what we all know, which is that you didn't actually help this young man, but you tried to make it look publicly like you did? And what kind of advocacy is that? Why would a judge even be the one personally making these kinds of phone calls and exchanging legal documents when there's an open court case that he is not supposed to be a part of? How is that anyone's responsibility, Clifton, except his own? And what happens when judges are allowed, and I relate this to Spiro, the judge
at the U of T, who
correct,
used his influence to get somebody scuttled from their position.
Right. So sometimes we can see that a judge picking up the phone to make a personal phone call and just share their opinions or concerns. Sometimes we can really clearly see that that's wrong. And then sometimes we like the person and we don't want to acknowledge that what they're doing is wrong. We want to attack the messenger. And so I don't think that Spiro was right for getting Valentina Azarova fired at U of T, because he shouldn't have picked up the phone and interfered in her hiring process. And I don't think Donald Mcleoad should have picked up the phone and called Professor Abdullahi and interfered with an ongoing federal court case when he had to say on his stand to save himself, I wasn't involved. You sure tried to be involved, but not to help Abdul, to silence those people who were criticizing you because you wouldn't really help.
Let's get back to the cash, brother. Let's get back to the follow the money. Or you said just to recap, you said that over $700,000 you believe that the Federation of Black Canadians under Judge Mcleoad got months after or very soon after they were formed.
So the Federation started publicly in December 2017. Since then, they have received almost $700,000 from Heritage Canada, one grant for $430,000, another grant for about $260,000. As I said, one of these was for a supposed anti-racism campaign, and I don't have my note on the other one here, but it was another Heritage Canada grant. Interestingly enough, by the way, Clifton, just to show you what this reporting is really about, which is a small number of powerful people in Black circles trying to control all of the resources. The person who's very senior at Heritage Canada now, who is named Peter Flegel. Peter Flegel testified at Justice Mcleod's hearing because he was one of the people who was writing all of Justice Mcleod's, like he was writing suggested memos and suggested public communications. He and Mcleod never worked together as part of the same organization, but for some reason, Peter Flegel took credit for writing all of these communications that were kind of putting Mcleod under scrutiny at the OJC. That same person who testified and said Justice Mcleod did nothing wrong, he's now the head of Heritage Canada, which is giving hundreds of thousands of dollars to the FBC. I think people should know that. And if people want to conclude that there's nothing wrong with anything I've just said, that's up to them. But there was a lot of reporting earlier this year when $25 million for the Black community, parts of it were denied to certain Black organizations because the letter from the ministry said, you're not Black enough.
Black enough. And that's $25 million over 5 years for the entire Black community across the entire country of Canada, right?
A complete drop in the bucket. And yet, groups like FBC have been competing for that funding after telling the community, based on the wisdom of Howard McCurdy, we will never do this. So people don't like the reporting of a group that says we won't take federal funding and then decides to. But I just want to know why you would tell that to the Black community when you obviously have every intention of doing it. Like, I just want to understand why, if so many Black organizations are competing for federal funding, why this national advocacy group goes to private invite-only meetings, but doesn't tell everyone in the Black community, hey, this money's out here on the table. Instead, Justice Mcleod is showing up on behalf of FBC, and then later his judicial counsel is saying what we all obviously know already, which is that that's not really what a judge should be doing. And when he said himself that he wouldn't do it, it's very interesting to see him trying to justify why he did. And his supporters blaming me for reporting on it. If you're not interested in these kinds of acts by senior political people and people in the judiciary, you don't have to read the stories. You don't have to rate me. But honestly, those things matter to a lot of us because a lot of people rely on federal funding to be able to have an organization. When you say you're not going to apply for their funding and then you're taking hundreds of thousands of dollars, I think that's a news story, Clifton. And it's going to continue being a news story, even though people may not all like it.
Wrap your head around something that I've had a hard time wrapping my head around, right? Is that back to that $25 million over 5 years across the entire country for Black organizations. One of the stickling points that got a feeding frenzy and a bit internal cannibalism going, where the group split into 2, 3, 4 power struggle between the Toronto, Ottawa, and Halifax camp, that the government was looking for a third party to funnel the money through. And somewhere later on, didn't the Federation became that third party while they were going after the money?
One of the things that initially got the attention of Faith Finnestad, who filed the first complaint against Donald, this colleague of his, this judge, noticed that he had been publicizing a meeting that he had with Justin Trudeau, the Prime Minister. So FBC, before it had, again, sought a mandate from the Black public, was seeking to influence Prime Minister Trudeau in meetings. So they had a meeting with him and they presented a slideshow. This slideshow was shown at the hearing. The slideshow suggested to Prime Minister Trudeau that if they want to create and deliver federal funding for Black communities, that the Federation of Black Canadians should act as an intermediary group, as they called it, in order to receive those dollars and then redistribute them to Black communities across Canada. In other words, 6 months before the public even knew that there was an FBC, Justice Mcleoad and that group were saying, give us money that you want to redistribute to Black communities, and we'll help you do that. They hadn't even incorporated it yet. This is what access and power can do. And this is how you can leapfrog over Black institutions and small community groups that have been doing this stuff for years and decades. If you have powerful friends, you can jump the line and you can start already being like, hey, why don't you give us that money? So even before FBC was announced to the public, Justice Mcleod's group was suggesting, let us be an intermediary for funding. And they even had a chart in their presentation to Trudeau that showed how that would work. So fast forward now 2 years to 2019, because the government took forever to start even thinking about releasing these funds, some of them. So now 2 years have passed and there's a meeting, year and a half, I guess is fair, because that was end of 2017. Year and a half, or sorry, it's 2 years because the meeting with Trudeau was June in any case. Now Employment and Social Development Canada is thinking about distributing this 25 million. And they are telling the public, we want to do this intermediary model, which is interesting because that's the exact same thing that Justice Mcleod and FBC proposed 2 years before. So even though he had already been to one hearing, and even though that hearing had concluded that you've been lobbying and lobbying is incompatible with judicial office, Justice Mcleod was interested in going to this intermediary model because, I mean, his group suggested it 2 years prior. The only problem, as you say, is that now other groups had heard about this intermediary model and they didn't want FBC to be the only one. They wanted to get some of that money and oversight themselves, because if you're an intermediary, your organization gets some of the money and you distribute some of it to the community, but you get something for doing that. So now there's groups that are popping up out of nowhere.
Sort of like the WE scandal, isn't it?
I mean, I am not as versed in the WE scandal to know all the intricacies of that, but what it is clearly doing is creating a sweetheart relationship between one organization and government, and saying that anytime we have issues of the Black community, that money has to go through FBC. Remember, Clifton, that proposal in 2017 that they would be the intermediary came before multiple statements by Justice Mcleod that they would never seek federal funding. So even after he proposed it, he was saying, we'll never do this. And yet he had already put it on the table for government and for FBC. But yeah, now there were groups like the Canadian Institute for People of African Descent, like CAFCAN, like Dalmore Buddy Day, Learning Center in Halifax.
Push, wasn't there a push?
UN Push Coalition. I'll tell you the truth, again, as I say, how power is concentrated in a few hands. There are like a handful of people who literally created a lot of these organizations right when the funding was coming. And they're doing the same thing as FBC. They're saying, not all of these groups, by the way, but some of them, like the Canadian Institute for People of African Descent literally didn't exist until very shortly before this funding was due to be released. And if I understand it correctly, they were being strongly considered at that time to get some of this intermediary money. So that's how a very tiny amount of money has caused a very small select group of Black people who were invited to these conversations to try and jockey for position over it. And if people are only hearing about what I'm telling you, Clifton, for the first time, they should ask themselves why. How come a handful of like 25 or 30 Black organization in a country with over 1 million Black people, why are those few organizations not, again, sharing these discussions and decisions about funding with all the Black communities that they serve? Why are they going to these secret meetings by themselves and getting angry when journalists follow them there and try to find out what's being said inside? This is government money after all, is it not? So don't we have a right to know how the government is going to distribute our money?
And don't we have a right to for transparency and accountability for Black organizations or who identify as Black and solicit and receive money on our behalf? Don't we have some level of accountability and responsibility from them too? Like, for instance, what do you know that's happened to whatever money is been distributed of that 25 million through intermediaries or otherwise?
So this is where my new project with some of my friends, including Professor Abdullahi and Professor Jones, this is where this comes in, because Yes Everything is hoping to do some investigative work on exactly this. Like I said, I was very interested to hear that a ministry run by the same Ahmed Hussein, who I said was so close to these interests at the beginning. Now Ahmed Hussein is at Employment and Social Development Canada. And I think it's very important to know if he and his ministry were saying to some organizations that are like literally 100% Black that they didn't meet the qualifications, what happened there? What was the miscommunication there? We haven't gotten to the bottom of that yet, although the news—
That's been pretty bizarre. It's been pretty bizarre, really.
But I think that deserves legitimate reporting, and me and my colleagues are going to try and actually continue to do that reporting. But the thing is, we should have a very clear understanding. $25 million is not a lot of money, especially not over multiple years. So it shouldn't be that hard to track who's getting that money and what for, and what they plan to do with it, and if they actually spend it at the end, and what happens if they don't spend it. Like, we should keep account of the government side, because they started this process of even releasing the money years after they promised it. And if there is an election anytime in the near future, Clifton, I will not be surprised if the government re-announces that same 25 million that they still haven't spent, because we know governments do this all the time. Yep. That's the kind of reporting that we need. But if a Black minister like Ahmed Hussein is going to be scrutinized because he's part of that conversation, so be it. People are acting in some circles like Justice Mcleoad is the first and only Black person that I've reported on. I've reported on the role that Mark Saunders played as head of the police service in Toronto for 5 years, and the way that he covered for anti-Black racism, and the way he covered police brutality, the way he covered the Devontae Miller attack. Like, this is not new for me. Peter Slawley in Ottawa, who so many people had high hopes for in this city, who is now defending the white supremacist inkling of his police force and asking for more cops in schools and asking that there be no-knock warrants, but then when they do it again, making excuses for it. I've been critical of these Black people. Mm-hmm. I've been critical of lots of Black people in positions of influence, because that's what journalism is, and that's what my journalism is. And
let's jump over the fact that Judge Mcleoad was exonerated with a couple of slaps on his hand the first complaint.
Yes.
And what do you think? And then came the second complaint, which he's been exonerated from. We'll go back through and read some of the excerpts later on. But between those two times, what do you consider that the judge did that was out of line again?
It's really clear. Calling Professor Abdullahi to intervene in an active deportation case, and then saying later on, but I didn't actually help them and do anything, so I'm fine. The intimidation factor of doing that to somebody and basically calling them up because they've been critical of you publicly, instead of just letting people have their politics and doing your job as a judge and leaving those political things aside as you're supposed to, that was wrong. I don't think that's wrong because the OJC ruled one way or another. You don't do that. If you want to advocate for a Black asylum seeker like Abdul Abdi, do it the same way that all the rest of us do. Do it the way that he asks. Do it the way that his lawyer and his family asks you to do. Stop trying to find a way to sneak behind the back with politicians, have meetings with them that we didn't ask for, and then try to suggest to the public that we're helping, but when you're really asked about it, no, we didn't do anything. That's wrong and is not the right way for people to respond to advocacy. And by the way, Abdul's deportation was stopped. And FBC now, in 2019 at their second summit, tried to take credit for that in a summit, in a session that they did. They did a 1-year update. And in that update, they claimed that they had advocated for Abdul Abdi because he fit their criteria. We saw what they didn't do for Abdul, and they want to have it both ways depending on who wants to know. So when the OJC wants to know, they have one answer. When the public wants to know, they have a different answer. But for me as a Black person, you don't interfere in a life and death matter like that. You help the way that people are asking you to. And if you don't want to do so, then you have to deal with the criticism as a Black advocacy group. That's one. Calling 2 young people in Nova Scotia is the exact same thing. They're making a political public stance that you don't agree with. And let's talk about that for a second, because there was something called Lobby Day where this was happening. So again, Justice Mcleod's organization is very clearly a lobby group, and they're not really fooling anybody by saying otherwise. And he was told to stop lobbying, but we see in 2019 when this racial profiling incident happened, that he is the head of an organization that continues to lobby, that he is at least in title. They called him an advisor or something. But I'm sorry, I spoke to a lot of people who used to support FBC and don't now. And they told me that Donald is the decision maker of that group. And I'm gonna name names: Danielle Dowdy, Paul Bailey, people who used to be on the steering committee of FBC and then suddenly left. People say, why didn't you try to talk to them? We did try to talk to them, and we talked many times to people like Danielle and Paul. And ultimately what it came down to was them saying, we've tried to have our influence in this group, but there's one person here who's making all of the decisions, and we don't really know what to do about that because he founded the organization. So those people are a part of this story as much as the people who have been put out in the front of it, those people who used to support and work for FBC, but now don't. So I think that, yeah, when you pick up the phone again to call people at a lobby day that you organize, which you shouldn't even really be doing as a judge again, because Spiro shouldn't be lobbying, but somehow
Mcleod, and particularly since that you've been warned.
You've been warned, but it's like
Judicial Council.
People understand that Spiro picking up the phone, Justice Spiro picking up the phone in the Azarova situation is advocacy and is wrong. But when it comes to Justice Mcleod, they say, well, he's Black, so he has to help his Black community. No, the principle applies across the board. And like calling people who are embarrassing you, because that's what it comes down to, is that the 2 folks in Halifax who were being really loud about being racially profiled, you might think, well, why would anybody care about them doing that? Well, when you're at lobby day and you're trying to strike deals with the government, you don't want to be embarrassed, and you don't want the government to be embarrassed. So when people who were racially profiled start condemning what happened at Parliament Hill and saying these things that put pressure on politicians that you are trying to lobby, you call them up and you say, shh. And then as an added bonus, which nobody disputes, you tell them you'll be investigated. Well, a judge doesn't know better to tell people you'll be investigated and how that would be interpreted. Come on, let's be honest and call things as they are. My grandmother used to say, call things by their right names. Let's be honest why a judge who has people advocating and embarrassing politicians that he is working with, why he would have a reason to pick up that phone. The 2 people who were on the end of that call, Clifton said that they didn't feel comfortable with what Justice Mcleod did. And one of them said that she was terrified at the hearing. And they said, why were you terrified? And she said, because I got a call from a judge basically telling me that an institution was going to investigate me when I didn't do anything wrong. I really question the values of people who tell me not to report on things like that. I have a responsibility to other Black people who Justice Mcleod's actions have mainly harmed other Black folks. I have a responsibility to report on that. You don't have to read it, but please don't tell me that that's not in the public interest and that is some kind of feud between me and a public official, in this case, a judge. That is actually a really important thing that he shouldn't be doing, and people should be talking about it openly, because Clifton, as you know, I face a lot of attacks personal attacks for my writing. I'm facing attacks from anonymous people, many of them saying that they are supporters of Justice Mcleoad, but anonymously coming at me on the internet and saying a lot of really disgusting things. If there was a legitimate complaint against Justice Mcleoad for any reason, are these people really helping for that to be brought to light, or are they actually engaged in an intimidation campaign to say that people who cross this man will be punished, because you're not encouraging anybody who has a real, in your eyes, a real issue to come forward. What you're saying is, when you challenge this man, we're going to come for you. And I have experienced that firsthand, but I'm not going to be intimidated.
The judge seems to be made of Teflon. The first complaint made against him was accusing him of failing to uphold the integrity, impartiality, and independence of the judiciary when he communicated with and met with politicians on behalf of the Federation. He was cleared and now has been cleared of the most recent inquiry. Here's what part of what the inquiry said in the judgment. While we consider that both transgressions we have found could and should have been avoided, taking account of all the circumstances on which they occurred and Justice Mcleoad's positive contributions to the administration of justice, we are not satisfied they were such as to diminish public confidence in Justice Mcleoad's ability to carry out the duties of his office or the administration of justice generally. I'm going to get my lawyer to really interpret that for me, but let's go on. Quote, we have concluded that two aspects of Justice Mcleoad's conduct were incompatible with judicial office, but not so seriously contrary to the impartiality, integrity, and independence of the judiciary that, whether considered individually or cumulatively, they rose to the level of undermining the public's confidence in his ability to perform the duties of his office or the administration of justice generally. We therefore dismiss the current complaint. You know what is curious to me there is that cumulatively, individually, they didn't rise to the level of undermining the public's confidence. Is that like me farting, but because you don't smell it or you don't rise to the level of your nose, that I didn't fart?
That is one way of summarizing that decision. But I just want to be really clear about something, Clifton. And this is why I think it's so interesting that Justice Mcleoad supporters say I filed these complaints, okay? I didn't report on what Justice Mcleoad was doing because I wanted a certain outcome or non-outcome at the OJC. I reported on them because I don't think he should act so, period. And that is my prerogative as a Black journalist and a Black thinking person. That's it. But when it comes to the OJC, I would just go back to Justice Spiro. The Canadian Judicial Council concluded that the phone call that Justice Spiro made that led to Valentina Azarova losing her offer at U of T was wrong, that he shouldn't have done it. Nevertheless, they said the only punishment that we could hand out to you would be to take you off the bench. And we think that this doesn't rise to the level, that part doesn't rise to the level of our noses. So they dismissed what he did. How come people in our courtrooms are not able to behave this way and be so dismissed? How come if somebody does things that are wrong in the eyes of the court, that their freedom is taken away, that they're thrown behind bars, separated from their family members? I don't believe in the prison industrial complex, Clifton, but I am going to use my journalistic platform to point out that there are two different kinds of rules, one for judges and one for everybody else. And that a group of judges tend to believe their colleagues over the public, even when they know damn well that what they're doing is wrong. So now it's 3 times that Justice Mcleoad has done things that are incompatible with his literal job. But there has been no consequence for that. And that's on the OJC because they have to wear his credibility. They have to wear his representation, his reputation.
What do you make of, I'll read you the 2 last things from the finding, right? Which I find very curious. Quote, we hasten to add, however, this is after exonerating him, we hasten to add, however, that our findings in this case as well as the findings of the first panel, demonstrate that in the future, Justice Mcleoad must exercise greater caution in his community activities. It goes on to say, in a society that embraces diversity and welcomes positive change, testing unclear boundaries that place limits on otherwise positive activities may not undermine public confidence in the judge's ability to perform their judicial function or in the administration of justice generally. Here, but once the boundaries have been established, they must be respected. In the future, Judge Mcleoad should seek advice before engaging in community activities that are not clearly recognized as permissible. What kind of bullshit is that? What kind of, like, how do you interpret this? Doesn't it seem like some verbal flimflammery?
Anybody who follows the courts in this country is used to the kind of doublespeak that you just related, which is to say, for example, that we can acknowledge that an off-duty police officer and his brother attacked a Devontae Miller, but we will nevertheless conclude that it wasn't aggravated assault, and that when they didn't fess up when the police came, that wasn't obstruction of justice. They beat him, yes. They shouldn't have beat him. They didn't tell the police the full story, yes. They should have told the police story. Nevertheless, because a police officer is involved here and it's too high stakes for the institution, we're going to let them go with a soft one this time. One brother is going to get completely off. This is how judgments work in favor of powerful people. Same thing again with Justice Spiro. He shouldn't have made a phone call that led to Azarova being fired. Nevertheless, we think he's a nice guy. We think he's done some good things in the past. So go along, son. It would be too much onerous for us to punish you and give you the harsh treatment that we reserve for people who actually come before our courts. But for you, no, we think your intentions are good. I think that saying that somebody has repeatedly done things and those things are incompatible with their job is to suggest that Justice Mcleoad unknowingly or accidentally did those things. This is something that deeply troubles me, Clifton, which is to say, Justice Mcleoad answered repeatedly at his hearing, why did you take on all of these responsibilities that are clearly part of advocacy domain when judges don't do advocacy? And he replied over and over again about how he was basically one of the only people around who could do the functions with FBC that he was doing. He was uniquely qualified. I think that's really offensive to the thousands and thousands of Black people who've been doing this work for a lot longer in advocacy actually than Justice Mcleoad, and who are not compromised by their relationship with the judiciary. He stepped over a lot of people who do this work for real. His organization is taking money that people who do this work long time can't access. And it hurts me that he has to play this game in front of white people, that he had to do all that because there's just so few of us who are qualified to lead anything. I don't accept that argument. I don't accept that his involvement was accidental or that he as a judge didn't know what the line is. He has been told 3 times now that you can do it and you'll get away with it because you're one of us. I don't think that's good for Black communities. I don't think that's good for the judiciary. And that's why I report on it.
Judge Mcleoad definitely has his supporters, some of them pretty vociferous and very rah-rah-ist in terms of how much they support him and how much largesse they give him. He seems to be a made man in some ways. I don't know if he knows where the bodies are buried because he's been just slapped on the hand briefly by the OJC. In your own mind, Desmond Cole, how do you explain how the judge, because the judge, Judge Mcleoad's lawyers will be paid for by the taxpayers.
Yes.
How do you explain this brother's luck? Or is it luck or what?
No, I would say it's 2 things. One is what I just mentioned, which is that the judiciary is a fraternity of brothers and sisters who protect each other's power, and that even if you're Black, they are more likely to protect your power than not. That is what Justice Mcleod's experience shows us. But the second thing is that in Black communities, plural, some of us believe that keeping up with and competing with white people means being allowed to do what they do. So I can't tell you how many times I have heard that there are white judges and there are this colored judges and these judges who do these things all the time and get away with it. And all I would like to know is, are you okay with them doing these things and getting away with it? Or do you think that there's a problem with that? And when we get to do the trifling, underhanded stuff as Black people and get away with that, is that a sign of our equality and that we've made it now? Because again, that's just not my politics and it never will be. I think that a lot of people are boosting Justice Mcleoad out of this notion that I mentioned that he has portrayed, that he is so exceptional. And I think that that talented 10th kind of narrative has been around Black circles for generations. The idea that there's a few of us who are talented enough to lead the rest of us out of this misery of white supremacy. No. When you can't open your mouth for Abdul, but you can go and meet with the most powerful people in this country, you're making a political decision. And I don't think as a Black person that this clever, sneaky, playing with power stuff is actually getting us ahead. I think it's holding us back in so many ways. And again, I go back to the story of Abdul, where this all started for me in the FBC. It was not FBC that stopped that young man's deportation. It was thousands of people across the country who had never met Abdul, but who did what he and his family and his lawyer asked them to do. Write to the minister and say, stop the deportation. Whatever backroom stuff FBC wants to pretend they did or didn't do, they never publicly said, minister, stop the deportation. And that's all his family and himself and his lawyer were asking for. So some of us are saying justice for Abdul, and some of us are saying justice for justice. And I know which side of that I am on. So the political struggle within Blackness, I see it. I'm not pretending we're a monolith. I'm not pretending that my advocacy is holding back other Black people because we don't agree. We're allowed to have politics. It is this white supremacist system that tells us that we all have to act as one unit to get somewhere. We are individuals as Black people. Additionally, we are human and we are our own people with our own politics. We need to struggle. Some of us are socialists. Some of us believe in the capitalist system that exists now. Some of us believe in anarchy. Some of us believe in abolition, right? We are allowed to have this diversity, and telling us that we're never going to get anywhere until we all act like monoculture, like the Borg, and speak with one voice. Nah, we are human and we have our experiences that inform what we do, how we fight. And that's a beautiful part of being us too, man. As troubling and as frustrating as some of this stuff that I've been experiencing in this reporting has been, I do it because having a political value set and living by it, it makes life meaningful for me.
Two questions I want to ask you before we go. Thanks for your time, Desmond Cole. There are two very powerful undercurrents in the Black community. Seventh-day Adventism, Seventh-day Adventists, and also a very developed liberal lobbying, a liberal control of organizations, liberal Black liberals. How did you see those two strange manifested themselves in Judge Mcleoad's saga? Because I believe Judge Mcleoad is a Seventh-day Adventist.
As is Royce and James, who I read the quote from at the beginning there. So yes, it's true that that community are extremely influential and have earned a lot of really prestigious positions within institutions in Black Canada. There is absolutely no doubt about that. I think that the way that that has manifested itself is that Justice Mcleoad has a really loyal group of supporters who don't want to consider that he would do things that were unethical. And I actually get that, because I wouldn't want to think that about somebody who was seen as a big leader in my community either. But I don't think that people's support of him in one community should remove the need to like have accountability in his position as a judge and in his advocacy as a Black person. Now, as far as the Liberal Party goes, let me return to what I was saying before. Minister Ahmed Hussein basically told us at the conference in 2017 that he was a part of FBC, which is weird because it's a lobby group that you're a part of when they're lobbying your government.
And his wife was part of the board at the time, wasn't she?
Ebian Farrow was part of the steering committee. And after it was widely reported that she was part of the steering committee, she resigned. And I'm sorry, when your spouse is the minister and you're having meetings and talking to him, that's not appropriate. And again, like these are the kind of nepotism that, yeah, white people get away with all the time. I'm not looking to match them as a Black person to know that we made it. Like that's not my politics. So, but that's only the beginning. FBC, before it met with Black communities at large, met with Justin Trudeau, met with Marco Mendocino, Adam Vaughan, Kathleen Wynne, met with a number of high-ranking Liberals in this country and across the province of Ontario, and made them proposals to say, here's how you should spend your money. They hadn't even disclosed to the Black community that they were doing this yet. The Liberal Party needs somebody like FBC because we all remember Justin Trudeau's blackface revelations, don't we? He would like us to forget, but I haven't. Groups like FBC can really help somebody like Justin Trudeau to say, but you can't call me racist because I have these folks supporting me. And it's not a coincidence to me that after FBC formed, they weren't doing things like advocate for Abdul Abdi, but they were going to budget meetings and applauding Prime Minister Trudeau for his funding that has taken years to flow, his little raindrops of funding for Black people. FBC were right there, literally behind him at the press conference to applaud him and to release glowing press releases. They might not all be partisan Liberals, but they have endeared themselves to the current government in order to try and get some favors and some little crumbs for themselves and other well-positioned people. And you know what, Clifton? Some people don't think that there's anything wrong with any of that. But I'm not going to be liberated a few dollars at a time by a federal government that stole the land that we're sitting on, that has polluted the water that we try to drink, that has destroyed and polluted communities by mining on unceded Indigenous territories, a government that buries children in mass graves, and then decades later, when those mass graves are revealed, start crying about how they're sorry and there's going to be reconciliation now. I'm sorry. Black people's future is not going to be in brokering with those kinds of institutions. Kwame Ture said that power concedes nothing without a demand, right? So when we go and cozy up next to them and pretend that that's the future, when we say Kamala Harris, who is like, if chokeholds had been illegal, George Floyd would still be alive. When we rely on people like that, with that kind of thinking, when we rely on Barack Obama, who told Black people to pull up their pants while he was campaigning to be the first Black president, when we rely on them for our liberation, we see where we get. We see where we get. And it's going to take something collective and something that is informed by those who have been left behind in this society, sex workers, drug users, all the people that so many of my critics are afraid to support and talk about, asylum seekers, okay? People living in encampments across this country today, people locked up in immigration detention or facing deportation, our kids getting kicked out of school. There's a political struggle that says those people and their struggles need to inform how we fight back. And I am decidedly on that side of things, Clifton, and it runs me up against in conflict with people who want to take the Ahmed Hussein, Barack Obama, Kamala Harris kind of representation politics. This struggle is generations old in this part of the world as well. And so I know what side of it I'm on, and I'm going to keep going in that regard.
Explain the reasons for your new venture, Yes Everything, and what that's about.
Yes Everything is a publication, first and foremost, about everything Black, where myself and my friends can unrepentantly write about these subjects. You know, we're seeing things right now like the ongoing occupation of Palestinian territory by the government of Israel. and their insistence on just responding to criticism with more violence and more killing of Palestinian people, more annexation of land. We're seeing that journalists who want to cover this in a way that is even mildly critical of Israel don't have a place in the newsroom. I know all about this because of how I was treated at the Toronto Star, and how I was told that you can't be an activist in your spare time because that violates the spirit of the newspaper. Of course, that was never said to any of the white columnists who were also activists, but it was told to me. So I don't want to be in a journalistic space where people can control my content or my activism out in the world. And that's what Yes Everything is for, to talk these unrepentant conversations about difficult but important Black issues, but then also the struggle that we face on stolen Indigenous territories and the responsibilities, treaty responsibilities, and like human personal responsibilities we have to honor Indigenous struggle in this country. I want to give voice to a lot of people who are doing incredible work, give a bigger voice. They don't need me to give them a voice, they have one, but I want to amplify the voices of Indigenous people who are engaged in an anti-colonial and anti-capitalist struggle as I am. Other racialized people, you know, we're only a few hours removed from learning of this man who murdered 4 Muslim people walking down the sidewalk, taking their evening walk. And 1 little boy in the family is seriously injured. That happened last night in London, Ontario. South Asian people, all Muslim people, Black Muslim people, people who experience the racialization of being racialized other than white in this white supremacist society. This publication is going to be a place, again, anti-colonial, anti-capitalist, for them to talk their talk as well. And done some very interesting investigations so far into the Black North Initiative, which I highly recommend.
Which is with that headed by the cricketer, retired cricketer Wes Hall, isn't it?
It's a different Wes Hall. I know what you're trying to do right now. But yes, Wes Hall is the creator and founder of the Black North Initiative, which is, again, just another kind of representation politics sort of grift.
And they can find the publication where it's online, right? Yes Everything.
YesEverything.ca. We are on Twitter at YesEverythingCA. So YesEverything.ca, and it literally just started. We're looking forward to a lot of really stimulating and important work to be going there in the next weeks and months.
Thank you, Desmond Cole, for talking to the Eglinton West Pop-Up Podcast. They can get your latest book, the 2020 bestseller, The Skin We're In, A Year of Black Resistance and Power. I am the Eglinton Jerk, reporting for the Eglinton West Pop-Up Podcast. Be sure to check us out next time.
Thanks.